Thank you for coming out. This is a very timely event to talk about integrating the ideas that started, some of them with roots of empathy, but now are really more comprehensive. So I want to talk to you about that. First, a little bit about the modus operandi of the work that I and my colleagues do. I won't name them all. There's a great group based in Ontario, but also elsewhere. What we do is we do things, and then we write a book about it. Then we do it better, then we write a better book. And then we do, and we do. So by the time you're finished, you have a lot of books, but it's deceptive because they're coming from the work. And I probably have at least two hats on tonight. One is about the work we're doing in Ontario that the minister represents, that I'm going to position. It's actually, and I would say this, speaking for Ontario, it's not just about Ontario, it's about Canada. That is the work across Canada, the CMEC, the global competencies, the different provinces. I do think very much, because I know the world of education, that Canada both is already farther ahead and then has more potential to be even farther ahead to lead the world, not in a competitive way, but in a way where we make things happen, we share them widely, we have all kinds of visitors coming, we go out to the world. And so this is a very dynamic time for this work to be developed. And so I think it's really absolutely crucial that we continue to play the leadership role. Of course, we can't be leaders if we're not doing it well at home. When, about 4 or 5 years ago, we started to look more deeply into something we now call deep learning. Deep learning, I'll define, but it really means the learning is deep in terms of how you go about it, and it's deep in terms of what you learn. And so we look at that. And as we did that, some of the preliminary thinking was this. One, traditional schooling is incredibly boring, I have to say. Students will say it too. Traditional schooling is incredibly boring, and we have graphs that show engagement goes down as you go from kindergarten to grade 9 or grade 10. So we know this is not a criticism of the system. It's really that traditional schooling is not fit for the current purpose. And also it's not relevant enough, which is part of the boredom problem. It's not relevant to engage students in that. And you'll see how we're able to do this here and more broadly. And then this, I'm going to call that the push problem, the boredom of students. And of course, there's only one thing I think that's worse than being bored, and that is having to teach the bored. If you're a teacher, that's a more difficult challenge. So the breakthrough is to really move towards exciting learning that's engaging for both teachers and students individually and collectively, and that's what we're doing. So that was the push part. The pull part is, in some ways, it's the attraction of other things that are more exciting. Some of them are not good for you. Too much technology, for example, although we now put technology in its place, as you'll see, so that there's some, but the other pull issue is that we now know what exciting learning starts to look like. We just documented it in several districts in Ontario, for example. And that's exciting learning is describable. People can do it, and once they do it, they want to do more of it. So you really do get a big kind of attraction into this work. And it's a little bit of blip at the beginning, and then it takes off. So the bigger picture we have, and I'm not going to speak to it in chapter and verse, but about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, we started an initiative called New Pedagogies for Deep Learning, a bit of a mouthful. We just call it deep learning now, but NPDL it was. And what it is it consists of networks of schools from 7 different countries, and that these networks of schools work on this agenda together to implement it. It's like a living laboratory. And there are about 700 schools involved. So networks of schools, 7 different countries. And if I just do it alphabetically, Australia has 80 schools. This is all part of our NPDL co-learning enterprise on the deep learning agenda, the global competencies. Australia has 80 schools in Melbourne area, Victoria, 20 in Tasmania, and 15 have just joined in Queensland, so Australia. Canada, we have a very major, almost everybody's doing it in some ways, but we have 15 districts in particular 2 Francophone and 13 others, a mixture of Catholic and public, are part of this actively. And they're leading the way as much as anybody. When I write a good book, it's because I'm plagiarizing the best of practice. That's exactly what I'm doing, in good feedback words. So Ontario, very strong. Manitoba has 4 districts. We're just about to establish some in British Columbia, in the greater Vancouver area. Saskatchewan has 1. We're coming some in the east. So it's a Canada-wide movement as far as Canada is concerned. The third country, Finland. Finland, you possibly know, was at the top of the PISA, and everybody celebrated that, except the Finns, actually. They were a bit worried for 2 reasons. They said, we're not sure we should be at the top, but our biggest worry is we don't know how we got there, if we are. So we have to figure. Then they started to slip. The last 3 years, if you look even at PISA, we're not in love with PISA, but it's one marker. And they started to slip, and the government changed the curriculum towards the thinking curriculum, very compatible with what I'm going to talk about, absolutely compatible. And then when we talked to them, they said, what you're doing is exactly what our curriculum wants to be in practice. So that we usually work with, I said, we always work with networks of schools, try not to take out too big of a chunk at the beginning. So they joined with 100 schools 2 years ago when we started. They just added 200 more, so now there are 300. And it's a partnership between or among the municipalities, which is the equivalent of the district, the National Board of Education in Finland, and ourselves. And they're going to go to all 2,800 schools in the country over the next 2 years. We're going there later this month and are cultivating this development. So Finland it's a big attraction because the whole country is going to do it. And it is about the future of humankind, as I'll pull it out as we look at some of the evidence. And then Netherlands, a bit of a choppy country, had a lot of little bits and pieces of political parties and municipalities. We have 50 schools there forming a nucleus and a development. New Zealand, a very interesting case, actually. New Zealand has 2,500 schools. In 1989, they decided, had a big transformation called Tomorrow's Schools. And they said, we're going to get rid of all of our school districts. Don't take any notes, Minister. We're going to get rid of all of our school districts, and we're going to have 2,500 independent schools, autonomous schools. Each school will have its own board, they'll appoint their own principal, etc. So there's lots of autonomy. And then they began to do some good work because it freed them up. But they also started to see the gap go between, comparing schools, the gap between those that were well off and those weren't widened. So 2 years ago, and we were part of this, they said, this is a problem. So we want to kind of, where's the glue here? And they said, here's the proposal, and this is the proposal they made. We'll put in $369 million, and every school should be a member of a network of schools, all of them. And the network will be on the average 10 schools, and we'll have an executive principal. And then we'll focus on the agenda. Well, you can imagine if you're a principal or a teacher and a pretty strong union attitude, now the government says, we're going to help you by giving you this framework with an executive principal to tell you how to do it better. We call that the helping hand strikes again, right? It was coming at them. So they rebelled. We were part of it. I was there quite a bit. And the interesting part, and this was to the credit of the leaders, the minister and the chief executive of the Ministry of Education, they said, well, wait a minute, let's kind of reposition this. It's a good idea. We have money going in. We have a network idea. That seems pretty good. We have leadership to enable the network to be good. All of this seems to have good ingredients, but somehow we got off on the wrong foot. So they made the magical decision, which we supported, which was, they said, well, to the principals and teachers are in the same union, they said to them, well, after all, it's not mandatory, it's voluntary. We forgot to tell you that. And so they told them that. And then the network started to form, right? You can see why if you have this ingredient. They also established a joint initiative, they called it, between the union and the government. They worked out the guiding principles and the framework as to how these networks would be set up to work on government agenda, but have a degree of autonomy. So now we have about 5 of these networks that are part of NPDL, and many others are going to join. It's what we call leadership from the middle, which I'll come back to later. So that's a strong one. Uruguay is also involved, a very interesting country, wants to be, maybe 4 million people, wants to be a leading Latin American country in democracy and education. They're investing in that direction. They decided to use this NPDL as their leverage point. They came in with 100 schools. They've just added 200 more. They're a similar size and number of schools to Finland, but very rudimentary in terms of pedagogy, resources, and that. I'll use them as an example later. I'm very excited about what they're doing. The whole country is learning English. Not that that's inevitable or always a good thing, but aside from Spanish, they're developing also the pedagogy and the technology in an integrated way. In the United States, which is a lot choppier, I guess I'll say, in the last country I'll mention, we are now starting, I won't say every part, but there's one part I'm particularly proud of, and that's California. About 4 years ago, California, and 6 years ago when the governor was elected, or 5.5, Jerry Brown was elected as governor. He had been previously 20 years ago. And he came in, and I'm going to show you our Canadian and Ontario policy as drivers, what kind of policies work best to get people to move in a direction. And they had, as part and parcel of the U.S., had been mired in, there's no other word to say it, in No Child Left Behind, in a compliance-driven set of strategy, which was very negative and demotivated people and caused a lot of conflict. And Governor Brown said, I want to change that. And they happened as part of their work to send 3 teams of about 30 to 40 people for site visits to Ontario. This started about 4 years ago. It lasted 2 years. And they came in and they said, this was the state superintendent was part of it, the head of the union, some innovative superintendents from the districts. And they visit our schools. They got a presentation from the ministry about what we were doing. From several of us, we talked about it. And the long and the short of those 3 visits, they said, we want to create in California the Ontario version. And this is literally how they speak. The Ontario version of what California would be if it was a capacity building system instead of a compliance-oriented system. So we started to work with them in our team in partnership and do increasingly so. And it's big and it's complex. 43 million people, as large as all of Canada, 1,009 districts, 58 counties that are over those districts, so fairly bureaucratic. An elected governor who I've mentioned, but also an elected state superintendent, so they have different constituencies even though they cooperate. And we have just now established with 35 of those districts, probably growing from there, NPDL participation. And so they will be, I think, a leader for that country around education. And they've already been a leader to move away from No Child Left Behind and to create the new way. If you follow the US, you'll know there's a new federal policy called ESSA around student success. And that policy has got rid of most of the stuff of the bad No Child Left Behind policies and replaced it with a better set. And that this was really California did that before the federal government caught up to it. Not that I think the federal government there will actually be able to do very much. Our attitude in the US when we work there, because we work in several states, as long as the government doesn't do the wrong thing, we're happy. And don't necessarily expect them to do the right thing. I mean, that sounds a bit harsh, but so in other words, we work with the state. We work with California and a couple of other states that really want to do the whole system. Last point I want to make, and then I'll get into the content much more, the kind of focus I would say we take in our work, and this applies to Ontario, but also I'm talking beyond for our own work, is this. We focus on the whole system all the time. So whole system means that 100% of the schools, whatever it is, province, state, or country, not smaller than that, not a district, too small. Certainly not this school or that school. Whole systemness, we call it whole systemness or whole system improvement. So it's always on that. Secondly, we always zero in on pedagogy. What's the teaching and learning relationship, whether it's play-based curriculum earlier or what we call it the new pedagogies or the roots of empathy is another example. Roots of empathy is a pedagogy. It's how to learn different things that are deeper and more important. And so we always invest in pedagogy. And the third thing, and this is demanding, and it's important to say it this way, we want to look at and understand the causal pathway between the changes in pedagogy and measurable student learning outcomes. The causal pathway for measurable student learning outcomes. Those outcomes are being broadened, and you'll see our set, and Ontario is broadening them. But the reason we want to be that specific is not for prescription, and actually not even for accountability, but for clarity of how you make improvement. It's for the people doing it that makes that so important, because if they get more clear, they can do more of it. So it's what we call internal accountability, and then you wrap around it external. So that's a bit of you get the flavor of this possibility. Coherence is one of our favorite kind of focuses now, and I want to just explain the concept because it's a very important distinction. We wrote a book last year called, Joanne Quinn and I, one of our co-leaders, called Coherence. The subtitle is actually Using the Right Drivers for Improvement. And coherence, the most important thing to think about is two things. One is, it is not alignment. Alignment is when you say, okay, we better have curriculum, we better have pedagogy and assessment, finances integrated, professional learning, all of those things that are part of that, and that's good to do. But alignment is not coherence, because coherence is only the following thing. It's fully and only subjective. Fully and only subjective. This means that when the ministry or the government says, okay, we've got a plan, it's very coherent, then I say that's an aligned plan, but what I want to know is, do people who are in the sector working on it, do they have a subjective clarity? And it's not only individual subjective clarity, it's shared. So our official definition of coherence is that it's the shared depth of understanding about the nature of the work. And right away, you know that you can't get shared depth by a good document. You can't get it by a good professional development day. You can only get it one way, and that's by working on it day after day purposefully to create it. Create it among the people and have it aligned with the policies that we're talking about. So I mentioned about drivers, and this is a little bit, I'm going to give you some very concrete things soon. But I did a paper in 2011 that was called Choosing the Wrong Drivers for Whole System Change. And a driver is a policy. A wrong driver is a policy that doesn't work. And you might say, well, why do politicians use wrong drivers? And I would say certainly the ones that we know in the US and to a certain extent England, because they can, that's one reason. Because the wrong driver can be legislated, even though it doesn't work. Because the wrong driver can be made to appeal superficially to the public. So there's a lot of reasons why people try to take shortcuts. So if you look at that right-hand side, which I call the wrong drivers, they are punitive accountability. Thankfully, we don't have that. But every time you have punitive accountability, people have tried to tighten up performance in a way that backfires. It backfires for motivation. So I'll come back to accountability, repositioning it. The second thing that doesn't work, and this is a little more subtle, is I'm going to call it the individualistic fallacy. And it goes like this. It's human capital, really, and economists and policymakers really think initially this way. If only we could get stronger teachers into the profession and weed out the other ones, but get better teachers. If only we could get better leaders in the profession, so we have standards and leadership incentives. And when you look closely at that, the theory of action is if we could get better individuals, the system would change. Well, it turns out the system changes the individuals faster you can produce them. You have to actually change the culture, not the individuals. And then they start to work together. I'll come back to that. Technology, wrong driver. I've looked at this for the last 5 or more years. Technology, the main strategy broadly, and I'm going to come back more positively because we're using technology deeply as the whole province is better and better. I'm going to come back to it later, but the best way of thinking about it, there is one word that explains the strategy about technology, the strategy in all over the place in the last 5 years. And the word is this: acquisition. You buy it. That's your strategy. You buy more iPads, you buy more of this, you buy more of that. There's more technology present. And clearly, and the research is very clear, In last September, OECD had a report that was computers, students, and achievement. And what they showed by country was the countries that spent the most on technology were less effective in achievement than the countries that spent less but were more focused. Makes sense, right? But this is proof positive. They said technology, people are going down the wrong track. They're loading up on technology. And then fragmented strategies, obviously a problem. Ad hoc strategies that don't, not only do they create overload and initiative fatigue and innovation fatigue, but they're also disconnected. So the opposite of coherence. And on the left-hand side, or what we call the right drivers, this is really Ontario's story since 2004. That's how we came to identify these. We said, when you combine capacity building, and capacity building, fancy word, all it means is competencies, new skills and competencies. And I would put them in only two bins for this solution I'm talking about. One bin is the pedagogical bin. How do you teach differently and better reach more people? And the other bin is the change bin. How do you lead this when people are not so sure they want to do it at the beginning? So the leadership quality, and I'll come back to some really interesting insights about leadership in this respect. So clearly capacity building is part of that. Second one, teamwork. Again, I'll come back to it. Collaborative work. Collaboration as an end in itself doesn't produce much. It's got to be focused. It's got to be specific. It's got to be on the right agenda. So let's not fall in love with a silver bullet of collaboration. It doesn't solve anything unless it's very particular and it's tied to the other three things. Pedagogy again. Pedagogy is the driver. Technology is the accelerator. It's the reverse of what people have tried to do. And systemness is not a real English word, but it's a good concept. And it doesn't mean, it's not even abstract. The way we define it is you promote the following thing. Individuals all over the place start to do a better job in their own right, and at the same time they realize they're part of a bigger picture. They're part of a bigger system. And you can say that we just do the building blocks pretty straightforward. When a school has an individual culture, individualistic, and it becomes collaborative, the following thing happens every time. Individual teachers in their classrooms stop thinking about my kids only and start thinking and being committed about the kids in the whole school. When schools work in networks, individual principals start to be almost concerned about the success of other schools as their own, in their own network. That's an increment of systemness. And it turns out when you contribute to the slightly bigger picture, as I've just described it, you also gain from the slightly bigger picture. You feed the system and you're fed by it. And this is a mutually developmental proposition. If you take the left-hand side of that and you build your strategies as we have here and we are now, and you make that your kind of raison d'etre, the basis of what you do, you can selectively then introduce accountability. You can selectively introduce individually, certainly technology, and sometimes ad hoc policies. So I hope that picture is fine. If you think about what I mentioned as the change, effective change process, there's an interesting thing about this, which is if you let people do what they want, change doesn't happen. If you tell them what to do, they won't do it. So you've got a dilemma here. How do you finesse this in a way that's understandable? And this is our definition. It's got two pieces in it. It's really simple, but it's complex. The two pieces are you have to shape and reshape good ideas, so the idea is not static. And you have to build ownership and capacity building at the same time. Bit complex for leaders to do that. And let me give just a couple of quick examples. We work in Australia quite a bit. We were working several years ago in ACT, the Australian Capital Territory. And we were in the secondary school in Canberra. And they had just introduced, the Director General had, a new Director General came in. He asked us to work with him for 3 years. The system was kind of stagnant. 80 schools, they needed to make changes, and they did. And in this first year, we were in the high school, and the school had introduced a peer coaching framework. They trained 3 teachers on a quality teacher framework to observe teachers, give them feedback to improve. And when we were there that day, most of the teachers said to us, we don't like this. We don't want our peers coming into our classroom, observing us and telling us what to do. It's not for us. I'm going to call that resistance. It was widespread. They didn't want to do it. They did a number of things that I can pull out if you want. And then 3 years later, where we were there. We were doing filming, as we often do at the end of a consultancy. And we were in that school with the cameras. 100% of the teachers were using the peer coaching framework, 100% of them. They're mostly the same people that were there before. They embraced it. Teaching was more exciting. Students were more into it. Improvement on performance. Teachers were sharing, a lot of things like that. So at the end of the day, after we did this, I sat down with the deputy head of the school. I said, this is amazing from a change point of view. That you started here 3 years ago and you had lots of people who were against it. Now, 3 years later, same people, they're embracing it. Here's the killer question. What is this participation in the peer coaching? Is it mandatory or voluntary in this school? He didn't hesitate. He said it's voluntary but inevitable. Just appreciate the insight in that phrase. It's this. This is voluntary but inevitable because you've worked it through and because it works and you've debugged it and you haven't let people alone, but you haven't rushed them and imposed it in a certain way. Another much more succinct way of putting this, I recall the CEO of Honeywell was the company that he retired about 4 years ago, and they interviewed him about what have you learned about leadership in complex times. And he said, the single most important rule that I've learned the hard way, but now I know it, he said, is this. It's critical to be important. It is critical to be right at the. It's more important to be right at the end of the meeting than the beginning of the meeting. He was using a metaphor, right? If you're right at the beginning of the meeting, you're right in your own mind. If you're right at the end of the meeting, you've processed it. You're right with the group. So this is really what I mean by this. Combines passion and skills. This is a tricky one, and these are a lot of ins and outs of this that are fascinating about humankind. Passion is obviously pretty key to change, but let's play with it a bit. Here's one. Is it possible for people to have too much passion? I can give you the short answer. Yes is the answer. What if they have too much passion, they don't listen? What if they overbearing because they're right all the time, even though they're on high moral ground? Passion, passion, passion. So that's one thing, a little bit obvious. Here's a much more optimistic way of thinking about it. What if somebody doesn't have passion? What if they don't have passion? Teacher or anybody. You could say, well, they should have it. Well, what advice can I give that person if I'm a leader? The advice, have more passion, doesn't seem very compelling. And let's think of a couple of other things don't work. Let's say somebody, we're seeing a school, the school is not performing, there's a lot of students that are not learning as much as they should. We want to change that. And incidentally, almost all teachers will agree with the statement, all children can learn. 100% of them will agree with that if you ask them. But if a teacher is in a school where the kids are not learning over time, year after year, and they're the teacher there, deep down, I'm going to say, although they would never say this, they don't really believe that these particular kids can learn because they're not learning. And so what do you do about that? What's going to change their mind? I'll tell you two things that won't change their mind and one that will. One thing that won't change their mind is research evidence. Here's other schools just like yours, and they're successful. Exact demographics. That's not very convincing. Another thing that won't change their mind is moral exhortation. We have to do it for the kids. The trouble with those two things, the first one says it can be done. The second one says it should be done. But neither of them say how you do it. So what does work? When you give teachers experience with something new that potentially will work in relatively non-threatening circumstances with peers that help them, and they experience the development of new skills that get new reaction from students, and then they become more passionate and do more. So passionate is the dependent variable in that case, not the independent one. Once it's strong, it's strong. So that's a very important way to think about this, because we take it too superficially, I think, and say, of course, passion should be there. But let's create the conditions where passion flourishes. And then mobilize for individual and collective efficacy. I'll come back to collective efficacy later. That's when the group is good and it's working very well. So let's go back about 4 years ago. I wrote a short book called Stratosphere, very fancy title. I said there are three forces afoot. One is technology going wild. Another is pedagogy, which is not the strong suit of the profession of teaching, although it's getting stronger. We need to work with that. And the third is change knowledge that I just talked about. I said these three forces have to be integrated, and then we'll get some results. So that's what we've been doing. Then I said, What the solution has to meet a certain number of criteria, the learning solution. That this learning solution has to be irresistibly engaging for both teachers and students. Secondly, it's got to be elegantly efficient. This is, to me, the Steve Jobs criterion, which is put the complexity in the machine and make ease of use and access dominant. Even though the complex machines, the ease of getting into it is very much. Technologically ubiquitous, wireless personal devices 24/7. The school day is no longer 9 to 3. In fact, if you think of it in financial terms, you can double the learning day. You can double, literally, the number of hours learning in a day without it costing much more money. Double. Huge from an economical point of view. And 3, you'll see in our NPDL, steeped in real-life problem solving. This is the curriculum. The curriculum is immediately connected to real problems and using real problems to develop your literacy, your numeracy, your compassion, all kinds of things that come from this. This is how I started. And then recently when we were doing the work, I've added a 5th one. And the 5th one is deep learning. And the reason we added that is it's possible to be irresistibly engaged without learning much, like wasting a lot of time over excitement. So I want to up the ante and make it a little more rigorous. So let's get down to the substance of this. The learning outcomes, the DL part of NP, New Pedagogies, Deep Learning, DL, are the 6 C's. These will not be unfamiliar with a lot of people. The 4 of these C's have been around for at least 20 years. They're sometimes called the 21st century competencies, and they are creativity, communication, critical thinking, collaboration. And so those, the unfortunate thing is they haven't gone anywhere for 20 years. Now we're actually seeing them. And 3 of those at least show up in most schools. Critical thinking, collaboration, communication. Not deep enough, and that's why we're going deeper. The 4th one, creativity, hardly shows up, as we all know. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that shows that the natural creativity of young children up to the age of 5 starts to dwindle because of school. Because of traditional school, the creativity reduces. It's a reverse effect rather than the opposite, what it's supposed to be. And we've added, very importantly, the character education and citizenship. And you can see the definitions. We have tools and rubrics which not only take these for the definitional, but we operationalize them. A rubric means that we can look at teaching and apply the rubric, and the teachers are doing this themselves for each other's classroom, and say, are we at an early stage of this use of this particular C, or are we quite proficient in it? Are the teaching of the students engaged? I'm going to show you a video clip.
The Enigma Mission came from the students' ideas. They wanted to be able to capture something that was slightly mysterious, something that grabbed your attention. I'm out going about my business and I'm going to find the answers.
An Enigma Mission is a project based on deep thinking, and basically you have to choose a topic and you have to research very, very deep on it, and the more deep the better.
Welcome to the Enigma portal. Your task as a member of an Enigma mission is to explain the great paradoxes, conundrums and mysteries of our existence.
An Enigma mission is kind of like a passion project and something that the teachers will help challenge us to expand our knowledge of what happens around the world and what's in the real world out there.
I chose autism as my topic because I have a relative that is autistic, and at first I didn't know anything about autism and I was very interested in the topic.
I chose to do my Enigma mission based on the thylacine, also known as the Tasmanian tiger.
Miss Vine, our teacher, she said she would pick a few students to do this project about bone integration. And so we took up that challenge and we tried to do that.
But the main challenge for me was DNA. I was like so interested. I mean, learning from DNA is an Enigma mission in itself. I mean, it's not a question, it's a whole Enigma mission.
I interviewed people and tried to find out their understanding of autism, and I contacted a scientist.
I had to research about the animal and the process of bringing it back to life. I also contacted a paleontologist named Michael Archer. Him and a group are trying to bring animals back to life.
I'm not going to grow up to be a doctor, but I am going to grow up to be a computer engineer. So I don't know how genes can link with that, but with my genes I could produce some sort of new software or something.
We want them to be thinkers. We want them to be people who can create change, people who can make a difference.
This has changed my idea for what I want to be when I grow up. And also, I want to try and say to the world that not everyone's the same, pretty much. It's just because they have different body parts and stuff like that, it doesn't mean they're any different from us.
I think it's given me a whole new look of autism, and I think it's shown me a lot of what it's about, and I think I would like to be working on autism in the future and trying to help people with autism.
In the work now, and I'm going to say it this way, that character education and citizenship have made the other 4 C's come alive. They have made the other 4 C's come alive because now it's relevant. Now they're doing things. And when people use the 6 C's, incidentally, literacy goes up. There's still the skill component. I'm going to venture to say math goes up, but you have to put math into the equation as part of the skill development. And these, we call them the 6 C's. They're also called, and finally we have a better label for this, 21st century skills, wore thin 10 years ago, but we're still using it today. Now it's gone. I'm going to declare tonight it's gone. And it's replaced by global competencies. And that's what the language we'll use in Ontario and in Canada. And the variation of this is about the agenda. I don't want to argue over one C or another, but basically this is it. And if you could get this in place, as we're doing now as a lot of schools, we just did 3 case studies for the ministry of 3 districts, Ottawa Catholic, Simcoe, and Hamilton Wentworth, of what they were doing across the whole district in this domain, and it's hugely impressive, even though it's the beginning. It's only about a year and a half old. This has huge potential. I think we'll catch on in Canada. I think we'll make Ontario and Canada a leader in the world. So now we come to roots of empathy in a thing, and I'm going to say that our agenda now is going back to catch babies. In other words, when you look at roots of empathy, you do see the real life linkage. You do see the emotional development. You do see the 6 C's actually in operation. And you see babies as change agents, really, literally as change agents. And now we come to what I call the new pedagogical practices. You'll see that it is a partnership, a learning partnership between and among students, teachers, and families. So let's take students. You saw them there. They're interacting with each other. They work in groups. Students are much more involved with each other, learning from each other. The teachers, much more excited. And then as we've seen in our work, the 3 case studies we just did in Ontario, students got excited, teachers got excited, parents started to come more, families started to get, the whole thing started to go forward. It's really kind of roots of empathy writ large. And it's very compatible with what has started. And it's even more so because I'm going to talk about a theme in a minute about students as change agents. This is another way we think about this. I call it the 3 Mais. When you think of students and working through school and those that are not connected as well, these 3 things make the difference. My learning, which is really, how do you best learn? And if you ask students how you best learn, most will say, well, not the way my teacher teaches. And that's not a criticism, that's just their honesty. But then if you start involving them, as teachers are now, tremendous unleashing of ideas and capacity. My learning. My belonging, a big one for well-being. Students who don't feel that they belong to or connected are just silent during the day, disaffected, leave early, drop out, all of those things. My aspirations, what do I want to do? Where am I heading to? You heard that one student who said, now I have an idea of what I want to be when I grow up. Hopefully she'll change her mind because lots of other things will happen. But she's thinking about, who do I want to be? Now I'm 10 years old, who do I want to be? So very exciting part. This is what we've discovered, This is not something we had in our design, but it's something that jumped out at us in all of across the 7 countries I'm talking about. Students as catalysts for pedagogical change. I mean it literally. Students are causing teachers to change their pedagogy. Even with some teachers who don't want to do it. Even teachers who start to do it and then get scared because they can't control it. I'm no longer the center of control. And those that, you can see where this, when it unleashes this, what it would do. Students as partners in organizational change, a bit fancy language, but it's changing the learning environment, extending it to the community. The way the school, the class is organized. You go to John A. Leslie, you see really radical different formats of learning environments that are much more comfortable and engaging. And this one is a big one, students as forces for societal change. I do believe that the students today, I won't compare them to prior to 2000, but I have no doubt about these students. They want to help humanity, not because they're altruistic, but because they think that's the way humans should be. That's that reason. I think of the group in Uruguay, a very poor, one school we filmed, the way that Uruguay did it, they gave robotic kits to teachers and computers to all students and all teachers because they had minimal help and they wanted to kind of get a foundation. And in this one school, these kits stayed in the corner for about 6 weeks. And one day the student said, "Teacher, do you mind if we unpack them and see what's in them?" So they unpacked them. What was in them were instructions to create robots and YouTube videos about how to do that. And within 2 months, they did the following 3 things. One group was studying landmines, and they created a group of 4 or 5. They created a robot that could detect landmines. Another group said, well, birds are eating the vegetables in our garden. Let's do something about it. They created a small unit that vibrated when birds got near and scared them away. A third group, and I don't know how they did this, but 3 members of a family were killed by lightning on the beach, and they created something that could anticipate the imminent presence of lightning and set off an alarm. I mean, these are kids, these are 10 years old. One girl said, I'm supposed to help humanity, so I decided to start in my own neighborhood. We are seeing enormous explosion, is the only word I can use, and the traditional system, unfortunately, suppresses this unless you change the environment. And our strategy, just to summarize this, is to see this happen in the pedagogical domain, to change the school conditions, including leadership and the culture, to change the environment of that school, its own district, to change the infrastructure into the province, the policies and other supports. And you get transformational change. I'm very excited about this. It's unbelievably powerful. The new leadership that we see from this, because it is new, it comes from many quarters. Teachers are leaders, students are leaders, and certainly we need principals, but of a different kind. These leaders must listen, learn, leverage, and lead. I just did a short book on leadership around 6 tensions, and one of the tensions is leaders in this domain have to lead and learn in equal measure. If they're not learning, they can't lead. But they have to lead, because somebody's got to kind of converge and pull it through. Leaders help crystallize and act on emerging solutions, so it's a bit messy. Messiness is a precondition to new clarity. But you have to achieve the clarity, you have to worry about impact, you have to draw on the lessons and consolidate. That's what these leaders are doing. This is not theory. This is what we're finding. Treats impact as fundamental. Leadership in the learning age, cycle of trying things and making meaning. Co-learning dominates. This is repeating this in different words, listen and learn. And all of this is becoming to articulate now the new things that are happening and then to spread them more forcefully. So let me kind of round this out. This is what I call the new job description for students, helping humanity. These students have a natural predisposition to help humanity. It can be squelched by the wrong kind of learning experience, or it can flourish. And we see this developing. The outcomes of the 6 C's, if they're deeply learned, I think are entrepreneurialism, which is both social justice and economic development, being better citizens, being problem solvers, being committed solving issues. So that, and well-being, let's take well-being. One of the shifts here, one of the more comprehensive issues, and the minister knows this, we're trying to get a handle on describing what's the role of well-being, what does it look like, how would you know it? And what it is it certainly, to me, is an outcome of these 6 C's. It's an outcome of the global competencies. It exists when these happen. But the other shift that's happening is that when you first start looking at well-being, you concentrate naturally enough on what I'm going to call ill-being, the problems that people are having, and those are the priority. But when you start working on this, you start to move, in addition to ill-being, to well-being. What does flourish mean? What is joy? What is being a good citizen? What is being a human and making a contribution to the world? We are shifting, and I'm going to think that traditional schooling has not done much good to produce people who contribute to humanity. Traditional schooling. But this schooling, which requires the skills plus the value, starts to produce people who are transformational, not only in their own lives, not only in their own communities, but in their own societies. So we have been working with a more organized framework for this work, and we wrote the book called Coherence. These 4 things, we try to keep things, we have all these made-up words. One is simplicity. And simplicity is, how do you take something complex and make it simple enough? Simple part. Complex is how do you make those small number of things cohere and synergize. So these are 4 pieces of simplicity. Focusing direction doesn't mean you spell out all the plan in advance, but it means you have a good directional vision, you have good values, and people are ready to move in that. And then you start moving through cultivating collaborative cultures. Let me just say a word about collaborative cultures. I mentioned before that it's not a silver bullet. Collaboration is not an end in itself. You can collaborate to do nothing. You can collaborate to do the wrong thing. So what is collaboration that's the right thing? It's zeroing in on this agenda. And the good news from the research, many of you will know John Hattie. John Hattie, the researcher from New Zealand, he's now in Australia, brought out in the open about 8 years ago what he called visible learning and visible teaching. And he looked at the research and he identified teaching practices that teachers who got big results in engaging students in student learning, what were they doing? And he had about 140 of these. And he calculated the effect sizes and said there are certain ones that have big impact, such as feedback to students, such as involving students in their own learning, metacognition. 4 or 5 of those had a big impact. He found some that had negative impact. So the message was, let's do more of these ones that have this changing pedagogy. And then as people started to do that, and we know John fairly well, and started to interact with him 4 years ago about this agenda and said, what you're measuring are individual teacher practices. What we're finding is collective work is more powerful. So would you look at collective work? So he started to look at the research evidence. And he has a paper, the thought series, you can Google this and get it this way. It's called The Politics of Collective Expertise. Politics of Collective Expertise. And then he calculated, there's not as many studies available, but there are some. He said, his words, the new winner in effect size, above everything else, as we would predict, is collective efficacy. Collective efficacy is the new winner. It means when the collaboration is specific and focused, looks at improvements and gets into measurable impact, and has that spread and deepen. So that's what collaboration is doing in the new work. Deepening learning, very powerful. This is the agenda I just described in the last 45 minutes. And then securing accountability, our chapter in that, chapter 5 to be exact, we think we have solved the accountability problem. And the accountability problem is this. People say, well, if you don't have accountability, people will do what they want. Therefore, we have to tighten accountability. They tighten accountability, people rebel. So and when people win the rebellion, accountability gets pushed aside. And our conclusion is you can't replace bad accountability with no accountability. You got to replace it with good accountability. Well, what is good accountability? It is when, and this goes to Richard Elmore from Harvard said this 12 years ago. He said, no amount of external accountability will be effective in the absence of internal accountability. Internal accountability is about the work that, it's the responsibility, individual and collective. So when a group gets responsible for its own work, when they're committed to their assessing what they're doing and drawing conclusion, when they take the responsibility, then you see the accountability actually goes up. If you ask yourself, well, what if they don't do it? What do we do? Well, the fact that you can get people to move on this track because collaboration, all the things I'm talking about now, increase people's desire to work together and see whether what they're doing has an impact. And then they engage the external accountability system very well. They engage it because they want to know the progress. They're part of it. The conditions for this are 4 or 5 things. 1, focus on internal accountability. Doesn't mean individual, it also means collective, but it's the group. Focus on that. Do it transparently. You have to see what's happening. Do it with specificity. It has to be precise. Do it with evidence. Is it working or not? Do it with non-judgmentalism, which means your attitude is developmental, not gotcha. So you just put those ingredients I just described together, and you get a fantastic combination involving in this. So there's a couple of other things I just want to surface for you as I finish. One, also did a book on the principle a couple of years ago, and I did it mainly for negative reasons to start with, and it usually, thank God for the US, because they do the wrong things first, and we can learn quickly before they get here, they got interested 4 years ago in the role of 5 years or more, the role of the principal as instructional leader. And they said, well, the principal is key. The research says that, so they're supposed to be instructional leaders. So then they overinterpreted it. And they developed checklist and job description and had principals going from classroom to classroom, observing teachers and giving feedback. Well, you just imagine that. I call it micromanagement madness. Just imagine that from a principal's point of view. First of all, there are not enough hours in the day to do it. Secondly, it alienates teachers and principals, because now you're looking over my shoulder and giving me advice, and you actually don't know what you're talking about anyways. So this is all kind of so what's the answer? The research was misinterpreted because what the research said was exactly what I'm going to say right now. The principals who are most effective participate as learners with teachers to bring about the results. Participate as learners. Beginning principal comes in, does a lot of right things, resources, support, etc., vision, doesn't participate as a learner, does that for 5 years. 5 years later, they know as much as they did in year 1. 5 times nothing is nothing. Principal comes in, participates as a learner, really gets better and better at it. The key thing is that the principal's new role is this: to lead the school teachers in a process of learning to improve their teaching. Key phrase, while learning alongside them and getting better and better at that. 10 days or so ago, I was with the researcher whom Malcolm Gladwell made famous. Malcolm Gladwell identified, among other things, the 10,000-hour rule. If you put in 10,000 hours of development, you become an expert at something. Malcolm Gladwell said that. The researcher is Anders Ericsson, his name is. He wrote a book, released it last week. That's why he was here in Toronto. It's called Peak, P-E-A-K. And he said, well, Malcolm Gladwell kind of was superficial because it kind of implied if we just do 10,000 hours, any old 10,000 hours will get better. And he says, not that at all. What it is 10,000 hours of deliberate practice with feedback daily or frequently. And then he said the brain changes. You be able to get, because of the deliberate practice, you're able to see more about what the situation. And this is exactly why, if you've noticed in sports, how some players, whether it's Gretzky or Donaldson or whoever, who seem to be able to anticipate 3 or 4 plays at the same time, they have mental representations of what's happening that other people don't have because they put in the 10,000 hours to get that good. And that's what school leaders and teacher leaders and teachers have to do in order to do that. We also consolidated this work around these 3 capitals, we call that. Professional capital is the label. Human capital, quality of individual. Social capital, quality of the group. Decisional capital, quality of the evidence that is used. Do you use that? I've already said human capital is not a good way to carry the day. Social capital is, when you get the group working, collective efficacy, it improves human capital. Human capital, actually people attracted to work in that group. Human and social capital get better together. We almost stopped the book there because we didn't get to decisional capital until we had the following discussion. We said, and this would say this just to make the point, we said, what if some teachers who were less than highly effective were learning from other teachers who were less than highly effective in order to learn each other's less than highly effective methods without knowing it? That would be social capital. Just wouldn't be very good social capital. So what's the corrective factor? Evidence. The habit in a profession together to say, is this working? What is the evidence? What can we do to make it better? And so I'm going to close with this slide. We call it leadership from the middle. And the conclusion is this. Leadership from the top, let's say the province, that you can only do so much for the top. Even if you get everything right, it actually won't work or last. So that's a problem. Leadership from the bottom, let 1,000 flowers bloom, that seems like a good idea, except when you let 1,000 flowers bloom, they don't bloom. And if you're into gardening, those that do bloom are not necessarily perennial, right? They could come and they go. So where's the glue? And we say the glue is in the middle. This is why we put so much investment now in working with a district, multiple schools, whether it's with school networks like New Zealand or districts as we are here. Because when the middle gets mobilized, you know, what's the history of the middle? It's the worst history of almost any, because if you're in the middle, you get orders from above and you get complaints from below. That's the life of the middle. What if you change that around and say, middle, you're the leader. You need to work on collaborating and getting the collaboration within the middle. You need to expand your middle so you're interacting with other people who are in the middle, other districts or other schools. You need to become better partners upward. And our rule here, incidentally, and this is just a good way of putting it for me, is you want the layer above you to like what you're doing, but not to run you. If you're a teacher, you want the principal to like what you're doing, but don't run me. If you're a student, don't run me. If you're a principal, district, don't run me. If you're a district, ministry, don't run me. But it's highly interactive. This is not isolation. This is partnership upward and back and forth. So this is the world that I think we are now seeing. We are creating it in many places. It's so desirable. It's so attractive. There's a lot of different problems here to get there. One concept I like from one of our colleagues, Bruce Dixon is his name, he said when teachers try to change their pedagogy, he said one of the problems, he called it legacy pedagogy. Legacy pedagogy is the way you're used to teaching. And even those teachers who want to change don't find it easy to do that. I'm going to say there's legacy culture. I want to change the culture away from individualistic, collaborative, then I can't really know what to do. And somehow I try to do it and I slip back into the old habits. So we need some push to overcome the legacies. The good news is a lot of people inside those legacies that want to do this. And when we team up with them, we get the breakthroughs. Thank you very much.